What one ordinary Russian citizen did last week crossed a line that the Kremlin had hoped would never be tested. And when that line broke, Russian security services did not hesitate. They responded with speed, precision, and a ruthlessness that has now caught the attention of intelligence agencies across Europe and beyond. This is the story of how a single fisherman's account threatened to unravel the Kremlin's carefully constructed narrative about the Kerch Bridge, and how Moscow killed the investigation before it could ever truly begin. For months now there had been whispers, not from official channels, not from state media, just whispers, that the Kerch Bridge was far more damaged than the Kremlin would ever publicly admit. Moscow has been defiant, yes, but they have been unusually quiet in their defiance. Their statements have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a script. But what set off alarm bells in Kyiv and Washington this week was that the pattern went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian infrastructure communications know the indicators: the sudden increase in military convoys rerouting through alternative supply lines, the unusual deployment of engineering battalions to the Crimean coast, the delayed freight schedules, that Russian railways quietly stopped publishing the sudden disappearance of live traffic cameras that had streamed continuously for years. All of that went quiet, and whenever the Kremlin goes quiet about something this significant, it means something is about to get loud. The Kerch Bridge, Putin's personal vanity project, the 18 billion ruble symbol of Russia's annexation of Crimea, has been attacked twice since the full-scale invasion began. Each time Moscow downplayed the damage. Each time state media assured the Russian public that repairs were swift and complete. But those who watched closely knew better. Satellite imagery showed structural concerns that engineers said could take years to fully address. Load limits were quietly reduced. Heavy military equipment was increasingly shipped by ferry rather than rail. And then, 3 weeks ago, something happened that the Kremlin never expected. A witness emerged. Early last Tuesday, local security services in Kerch received what they described as a civilian report of unusual activity near the bridge's eastern span, activity that included detailed observations of structural damage that had not been disclosed in any official assessment. These are the kinds of observations that the Kremlin only tolerates when they can control the narrative. But this witness, a 63-year-old fisherman named Dmitry Volkov, had done something that changed everything. He had filmed it. For weeks, Volkov had been fishing in the waters beneath the Kerch Strait, as he had done for decades, but in recent months he noticed changes: repair crews working at unusual hours, sections of the bridge cordoned off without explanation, and most disturbingly, visible stress fractures in support columns that he had never seen before. Ukrainian intelligence didn't know whether Volkov was motivated by patriotism, by anger, or simply by a fisherman's stubborn honesty, but what they did know was that his footage, nearly 40 minutes of close-range video, showed damage that contradicted everything Moscow had claimed. And when a Russian citizen documents what the Kremlin wants hidden, even by accident, the response is never subtle. The response issued by FSB Regional Command that night was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Sources within the Russian security apparatus, speaking to foreign journalists under strict anonymity, described the Kremlin's reaction as panicked, immediate, and perhaps most importantly, personally directed from the highest levels of the presidential administration, but suppression only works if the evidence is contained. Volkov's footage was not. In fact, within 6 hours of his initial report to local authorities, fragments of his video had already reached Ukrainian intelligence through channels that remain classified. Here's what we know. Within 3 hours of Volkov filing his report, FSB officers arrived at his home in the small coastal village of Zavitnoy. These weren't the local police who might have responded to a routine complaint. These were counterintelligence specialists, operatives that the FSB only deploys when they are preparing to make someone disappear from public view. Tonight, sources with direct knowledge of the situation confirmed that FSB officers conducted a comprehensive operation targeting Volkov and anyone who had contact with his footage, including his nephew, a 28-year-old IT worker who had helped his uncle upload the video to a cloud server before authorities arrived. The Kremlin moved before the footage could spread further. They seized Volkov's phone, they seized his boat, they seized the laptop belonging to his nephew that contained the only known backup. In other words, the FSB targeted every node in the chain of evidence, the storage devices that would have proven authenticity, the metadata that would have confirmed the timeline, the witnesses who could have corroborated what the video showed. This is what made the speed of the response so alarming. The Kremlin suppression wasn't just thorough, it was surgical. It represented the kind of coordinated operation that requires pre-positioned assets and pre-approved authority. And the FSB, understanding that fully, executed with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but systematically. They didn't arrest Volkov publicly where neighbors could witness. They didn't file charges that would create a paper trail. They detained him under provisions of Russia's wartime censorship laws, provisions that allow indefinite holding without trial or legal representation. Within 12 hours, Dmitry Volkov ceased to exist in any official Russian database. His fishing license was revoked retroactively. His residence registration was deleted. His nephew was transferred to a detention facility in Krasnodar, 300 kilometers away, where communication with family members is prohibited. And here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. Western intelligence analysts now believe that the Kremlin's rapid response was designed to test the integrity of their own internal security apparatus after months of embarrassing leaks. Moscow wanted to see whether regional FSB commanders would execute suppression orders without hesitation or documentation. And that is exactly what happened. The local investigation that should have followed standard protocols didn't stumble or delay. It vanished with an efficiency so complete, so coordinated, that even seasoned observers were impressed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily, but Dmitry Volkov did. A senior European intelligence official speaking with Reuters under anonymity described the FSB's operation as a stress test, a way to measure how quickly inconvenient truths could be erased in the current wartime environment. But what Volkov's footage revealed cannot be so easily buried. Ukrainian intelligence sources speaking this week confirmed that fragments of his video had already been transmitted before the seizure. Their analysts were not only reviewing the footage, they were cross-referencing it with satellite imagery so precisely that structural engineers have now produced independent assessments of the bridge's actual condition. That cross-referencing matters because it shows the Kremlin's vulnerability. It shows that Russia is not controlling the narrative as completely as they believe. They are losing it. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learn more about the scale of the Kremlin's suppression. FSB officers conducted searches at 14 separate locations across Crimea, forcing the deletion of social media posts that had referenced unusual bridge activity. Russian telecommunications authorities ordered mobile carriers to purge location data for devices that had been active near the bridge during the hours Volkov was filming. State media editors received classified directives prohibiting any coverage of structural concerns related to the Kerch crossing, directives that specifically mentioned fishing-related civilian reports. This wasn't just censorship. This wasn't just intimidation. This was systematic erasure. This was institutional panic. And institutional panic is the one thing the Kremlin has struggled to hide since the invasion began. For every narrative victory Moscow has claimed, the truth has countered with something that undermines their credibility further. Remember, the Kremlin thought they could control information about Crimea indefinitely. They thought that after a decade of occupation, the peninsula was secure. They thought that Russian citizens living there had been sufficiently pacified, too afraid or too indifferent to document what they saw. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. A fisherman with a smartphone proved more dangerous than a division of Ukrainian Marines. A 40-minute video threatened a narrative that cost billions of rubles to construct, and a 12-hour suppression operation revealed just how fragile that narrative truly is. What makes this moment so significant and so revealing is that the Kremlin's response happened at a time when Putin is under unprecedented internal pressure. The military commanders want more resources for offensive operations. Economic advisors want reduced sanctions exposure. Regional governors want infrastructure investments that keep getting diverted to the war. And hardliners want visible demonstrations of Russian territorial control. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a war that has lasted far longer than anyone in his inner circle predicted. And when leaders in that position suppress civilian testimony with this level of urgency, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The Kerch Bridge is not just infrastructure, it is a symbol. And symbols cannot afford witnesses who tell a different story. Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate, in a statement now circulating among NATO partners, was designed to signal that Kyiv is not willing to let the Kremlin's suppression succeed. Officials said plainly that Russia's detention of civilian witnesses was inconsistent with any legitimate security purpose. That is diplomatic language for they're hiding something catastrophic, and we have proof. You don't usually hear that tone from Ukrainian intelligence unless something significant is confirmed. The statement went further, noting that structural assessments derived from Volkov's footage would be shared with international partners, a clear signal that whatever the Kremlin erased locally now exists in multiple secure locations outside Russian reach. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation in a measured, deliberate speech tonight. He said, "The bridge they built on stolen land is crumbling, not just its concrete, but its lies." He said, "One honest man with a camera did what their entire propaganda machine cannot undo." And he said, "We see what they are hiding, we know what they fear, and we are patient." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how powerful the truth can be when the enemy is desperate to suppress it. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. The Kremlin's suppression of Volkov wasn't isolated. Along with his detention, Russian authorities also arrested 2 local journalists in Sevastopol who had been investigating bridge-related supply disruptions. FSB cyber units launched coordinated attacks against Ukrainian Telegram channels that had begun sharing infrastructure analysis, and Moscow increased pressure on neutral shipping companies to avoid routes where observation of the bridge would be possible. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When the Kremlin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that the Kremlin is preparing domestic audiences for an eventual acknowledgement that the bridge requires major reconstruction that could take years. Another is that Moscow is attempting to buy time while alternative supply routes through occupied territories are reinforced. A third possibility, the one worrying Western officials the most, is that the Kremlin is preparing to blame any future bridge failure on Ukrainian terrorism, using the suppressed evidence to construct a false narrative for domestic consumption. But today, the existence of Volkov's footage outside Russian control took that card off the table. They can't claim a surprise attack if satellite imagery and civilian video prove the damage was already there. They can't blame sabotage if the structural failures match engineering assessments of previous strike damage. They can't manufacture a crisis if the timeline contradicts their own internal communications. The truth, once escaped, cannot be recaptured. What we're watching now is a test of information control. The Kremlin wants to see if total suppression within their borders can outpace the spread of evidence beyond them. Ukraine wants to show that no amount of censorship can erase what the world has already seen. European intelligence services want to prevent Russia from constructing false pretexts for escalation. And ordinary Russians, if any, are paying attention, may be wondering what else their government has hidden about a war that was supposed to be over in 3 days. Tonight, we've heard from sources who are now monitoring Russian military logistics in real time. They say freight shipments across the Kerch Bridge have decreased by over 40% compared to pre-war baselines. They say the Kremlin has quietly approved emergency funding for ferry capacity that official budgets never anticipated. And they say Russia's decision to erase Dmitry Volkov is likely part of a broader strategy intended to maintain the illusion of normalcy until alternative routes are fully operational. But Ukraine is not accepting that timeline. In fact, Ukraine is accelerating pressure on exactly those alternatives. Their response today, precise, documented, and internationally coordinated, sent a message to Moscow that suppression has consequences. And it sent a message to the Russian public that the truth does not stay buried forever. As the coming weeks unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Volkov captured and what the Kremlin feared enough to act within 12 hours. But what we do know is that Ukraine's preservation of his footage was timely. It prevented a complete erasure, it created an independent record, and it demonstrated that Russian information control has limits that ordinary citizens can breach with nothing more than a phone and the courage to document what they see. What happens next will depend on what the Kremlin does in the coming days. If they escalate suppression, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a new phase in Russia's internal crackdown. If they attempt to spin a new narrative, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared to counter with evidence. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time since the bridge was attacked, the Kremlin appears to be genuinely afraid. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when the Kremlin is quiet, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully, because tonight Moscow learned something they should have understood long ago. You cannot bomb the truth into submission, you cannot arrest evidence out of existence, and you cannot silence witnesses when their testimonies already escaped your borders. This story is far from over, but tonight one thing is clear: the Kerch Bridge is weaker than Putin will ever admit. The Kremlin's control is more fragile than it appears. And one fisherman named Dmitry Volkov, wherever he is now, showed the world what Moscow fears most. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.